And we're back, and so are the Hawaiian shirts, for another great Cookin' on the Canals. I'm your host for the day, Derrick Pratt, the educator and interim curator at the Erie Canal Museum in downtown Syracuse, New York, back for another great Cookin' on the Canals segment, where we recreate the recipes of historic barge canal cook Oliver Wendell Petrie, a native of Oswego who in the late 1930s served on board an oil barge and a tugboat for a few years as their cook. So let's hop into it here, shall we? Today we're making oyster stew. And the first thing we gotta do for oyster stew is take a quarter cup of butter and melt it down. So we're gonna do that right now. I'll get through a few things. As always, thank you to the family of Oliver Petrie for donating his incredible artifacts, including his recipe book. And thank you as well to the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor, whose impact grant funding of our Erie Eats, Erie Canal Foodways project is making this all possible. All right, now, as we wait for our butter to melt here, there's a special reason why we're doing oyster stew today. It's a very personal reason for me. You see, it's March 2021. It's a Friday, which means it's a Friday in Lent, and I am a Catholic. So that means I can't eat meat. Asterisk, I can't eat meat that's not seafood. So oysters qualify as something I can eat. Also to note, Oliver Petrie, an Episcopalian. He was actually a vestryman in the Oswego Episcopal Church, and in fact, when he passed away, he was writing a history of that church. But I digress. Back to Catholicism. Many of you may be aware that there weren't a ton of Catholics in America when it was initially founded. There was only one signer of the Declaration of Independence who was a Catholic, but in the 1800s, America saw an explosion of Catholic immigration to America, and the Erie Canal Corridor did especially. The first group we see is the group that ultimately led to my faith, the Irish. I can trace part of my ancestry back to the Irish, and not on the Erie Canal. I want to be very clear about that. But the Irish are one of this first wave of Catholic migrants to America, and they help to dig the Erie Canal, and they really get involved in digging a lot of America's other canals and enlarging the Erie Canal between the 1830s and the 1860s. That's one of their many contributions, the Irish immigrants, who really start to come over once the Great Potato Famine occurred as well in the 1830s, 1840s area. But anyway, so this massive influx of Catholic immigrants and other immigrants as well arrive, but a lot of these Catholic countries have major impacts, their immigrants on the canal corridor, such as Poland, Italy, parts of Germany. Back to Italy real quick, while Irish canal workers were often associated with digging the first two versions of the canal, the barge canal was largely constructed by Italians and Italian immigrants. So that's another interesting bit of canal history. And all those folks would have been stuck like me in the 40 days between Ash Wednesday and Easter, not eating meat on Fridays. In fact, in and along the canal corridor, there's a great tradition of Friday fish fries. And something I didn't learn until I went to college was that haddock is really largely only eaten by folks around the Erie Canal corridor. That's not directly related to the Erie Canal, but I just thought it was an interesting fact. So, we're going to talk more about religion later in this episode as well, and the broad and diverse range of religions. But I thought this was a good way to get into that. And our butter is melted, so enough of me yammering on. Let's add some more ingredients. We've got 1 stalk of celery, which we're gonna dump in here, get it all out. And 1 chopped up onion, which I'm also going to dump in here. Now we're gonna let these items simmer in this pot for a little while, and we will be right back. Alright, so our vegetables have properly cooked at this point. So now we're going to get to the real star of the oyster stew, the oysters. But before I do that, I'm going to pour in to our celery and onions a whole quart of milk. Yummy. We went with 2% because figured that will probably stick better. Anyway, onto the oysters. I'm going to move away from our main focus, this cooking on the canals, religion in the canals, to talk a little about these slimy little mollusks. I would really encourage you to check out the great book, The Artificial River by Carol Sheriff, in which she looks at oysters. They open up the book as a great way to see how the Erie Canal totally transformed upstate New York. And really, these oysters are a great lens into this. You see, before the Erie Canal was built, it would have taken almost a month to get oysters from where they're harvested down around New York City up to a place like Buffalo or Syracuse, Rochester. None of those places could have conceivably had oysters. They would have spoiled before they got there. However, the Erie Canal, when it opened up, shrank time and distance tremendously. Now, all of a sudden, people in upstate New York could enjoy oysters. And we see newspaper accounts in journals and diaries. People are raving about how you can eat an oyster in upstate New York. It blows people's minds for a time, though, of course, eventually people get pretty used to having rapid transit, as it were. So the oyster kind of loses it's not as impressive after a couple decades. So let's see how we cook our oyster, shall we? We take 1/3 cup of water, cold water, as the recipe calls for, pour it in there. And then we are going to take a whole quart of oysters. There's a lot of oysters in here, and toss those in. The recipe says to cook the oysters until they start to curl. I'm not 100% sure what that's going to look like, but we'll find out soon. Quick other thing about oysters, though. The oyster, famous in the New York Harbor, all along the East Coast, especially famous in the Chesapeake Bay. However, the Erie Canal and other forms of mass rapid transit like railroads play a pretty substantial part that's often overlooked in the death of oysters on the East Coast, because the oyster beds ended up getting horribly polluted by industry, which was spurred by first canals, then railroads, then highways, everything else that allowed for a large industrial society to exist that could then dump all of its waste products into water. Luckily, however, oysters are starting to make a bit of a comeback along the eastern seaboard thanks to things like the Clean Water Act, which has also made the Erie Canal substantially cleaner. So, we've come full circle on our oysters. I'll be back once these oysters have curled. See you then. Okay, so our oysters have started to curl, which means we're going to take our oysters and dump them in with the milk and celery and onions. We'll stir them up a little. That's going to make one tasty stew. Before we get to the last part of the recipe, though, I wanted to finish up kind of where we started, talking a little about religion, because religion had a major impact on the Erie Canal, or the Erie Canal may have had a large impact on religion. Really both, kind of symbiotic. You see, the Erie Canal was a major driving factor in what was known as the Second Great Awakening, a movement in the country kind of away from predestination, Calvinism, towards a more personal and introspective kind of you do good things to make America a better place, that sort of theology, as well as a number of other religious movements spring up on the banks of the Erie Canal. You've got this religious revivalism preaching what I just mentioned, that's led largely by a guy by the name of Charles Grandison Finney, who he sets up a revival in the boomtown of Rochester that's famous. That area becomes known as the Burned Over District because they were burned over with the fires of religious passion. That kind of movement helps to eventually spark the abolition movement in the area, the women's rights movement, the temperance movement, all that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. Also, other religious movements like Mormonism, founded in Palmyra by Joseph Smith. Palmyra, of course, right on the banks of the Erie Canal. Brigham Young, kind of Joseph Smith's successor in the Mormon Church, one of his first jobs was painting locks on the Erie Canal. Additionally, there's other religious groups like the Shakers are near the Erie Canal. There's the Oneida community, which they're a really fascinating bunch of perfectionists. They create kind of a commune. Incredibly interesting story. I suggest checking out their museum right here in central New York. Fascinating stuff. They eventually become known. Here's where we get back to some food history. The religious aspect of it kind of dies away in the 1870s. They reincorporate as Oneida Limited, which you may know as the famous silverware company. At one point, the largest producer of silverware in America. So, religion and the Erie Canal go hand in hand. That's what I'm trying to say. And we will explore that more in future talks at the Erie Canal Museum, no doubt. I would also suggest checking out the book Heaven's Ditch, God, Gold, and Murder by Jack Kelly. Our friends at Schoharie Crossing had a great Q&A session with him last year, so check that out. Now, let's finish off this recipe, shall we? In our Syracuse glass, almost as always, is, of course, salt. A 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I'm gonna whoosh, pour that in, and then here in this Black Button Distilling Company from Rochester, another great canal town, we've got a 1/8 of a teaspoon of black pepper. Now that's going to go in there. And that, folks, is all the seasoning we've got. I'm going to stir it up. We'll wait for it for a few minutes just to make sure everything's nice and cooked and put together and stuff. Unfortunately, Oliver's recipes, while they're generally pretty vague, were especially vague for oyster stew, particularly involving thyme. So hopefully this ends up coming out well, and we'll see you folks next month for our next installment of Cookin' on the Canals. Thank you again to the Petrie family and the Erie Canalway for supporting Erie Eats, as well as the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. Thank you to them as well.